Hey, greetings, church family, and everyone who's watching this on social media. I am BJ. My name is BJ. I'm the pastor of a church called The Well, and I'm with two people in our congregation, Malcolm and Lori Billing. And we had just felt this is part of a series called The Dose of Hope that we've been actually doing through the COVID pandemic. But in the last couple of weeks, we have just shifted the topics of these conversations because in terms of when it comes to finding hope in a season like this, we have become aware through a bunch of events and then the conversations and the events that have ensued in the last couple of weeks that there is a hopelessness that many people in our world, either acutely or indirectly, are experiencing through the issues of racism and the bigger conversations around systemic injustice. And the question is, well, what does it mean for us as the people of God to have hope in this, and how do we respond to this? And one of the words, and so I've asked Malcolm and Lori, just as three of us from three different ethnic backgrounds, but also part of one church and a community and being friends, but also saying, we've been wrestling with this, saying, how do we move forward? And I think one of the words that we've talked about that is a big part of this is the word power. And very quickly, obviously, there's the idea of that the racism, systemic injustice is an issue of power, both in terms of those who have power and are either actively using it to exploit other people, either historically, certainly when it comes to even just tracing the issues that are particularly in focus in racism in America, we would look back and say, but also around the world. And I think any one of us who has experienced this in some way, saying there would have been active, sort of acts or perpetuating of that through people in power because of wealth, because of race, because of positions of power. But then also those that who are choosing not to use power and systems of power, whether it's policy, law enforcement, justice systems, things like that, that have power and the potential to be able to change things, but actually are not, are passive and are therefore complicit in some ways in continuing these things on. And that's sort of one of the key dynamics in the bigger picture. But the word power, I think, when I have felt about this, we talked, is a powerlessness, where if as and our hearts are moved by this, and we're saying, okay, but we're realizing these are big things, and the word system or systemic that keeps coming up is a recognition of something that is both perpetual and deep, but also tied to systems. And when it gets to that level, many of us say, well, I'm not in law enforcement. I'm not in a position of power. I don't have. So, and the vast nature of the issue can bring on feelings of powerlessness. I know I have felt that. How have you guys, as you've been thinking about this as individuals in your own stories, and then as people as part of the community of God, saying, in your respective workplaces, but also how have you experienced or feeling some of the powerlessness, and how are you wrestling with and thinking through, okay, what would it mean to actually take action in this regard?
Yeah, good question, Beej. And I think, like, as I look at it, I sort of, and I think about power, I think one of the sort of realizations is, in terms of sort of systems that are in place, is in some ways a recognition of all of the ways I sort of do have power in individual ways, as sort of a man, as a white person, in sort of a wealthy country, sort of education, again. And I think that there is a recognition of the sort of the privilege that I have, and sort of processing just the ways in which that unconsciously sort of impacts my own sort of lenses or way I see the world. And so I think that for me, some of the Black Lives Matter movement and some of these conversations has just sort of drawn me to sort of reflect in the ways in which sort of just the systems that exist in the world that I'm not necessarily thinking about on a day-to-day sort of put me in a particular position. That said, at the same time, I look at this issue and wrestling with racism and systemic injustice against Black people and against sort of, again, many different groups, and I go like, okay, I don't have the answer. I don't have the ability to directly put sort of policies in place. Like going, okay, I don't have that. But I think, and again, this is very much a work in progress. But I feel like the thing that stands out for me is, yes, I don't have sort of powers to deal with the world as a whole, but I do have influence in sort of some of the smaller sort of places and systems. So I think about sort of the team that I'm a part of at work. I have sort of relational influence there. I think about sort of my family, and again, sort of those connections, and then there's sort of influence there. And I think about, again, our church family, and I think our, like, this very conversation stems out of hey, I don't want to just process this on my own and think about this on my own. A part of this means sort of engaging in sort of talking about it and thinking about what can we do. And that doesn't mean coming with an answer, but it means coming with a, hey, I want to engage in this. I don't want to just let the systems and the powers that exist just sort of unfold as they are. There needs to be an active response to this with what I have.
Yeah, and you guys came to talk to me about this. Even this conversation was saying, hey, and you're working it out yourselves, and as you're talking to other people, there is this spectrum of some who would say, oh, I'm just wrecked by this, and like have been moved to action already, whether reading, donating, having conversations, going to protesting, like protests, marches, who are been moved to action right away. Then there's, say, maybe the other end of the spectrum of those who are like, oh, I don't, either because they feel powerless or like, I'm not affected by this, I don't really know, or this is like a political issue, this is a US issue, this is a local issue, it's an isolated thing, it's like the other things. Hey, doesn't everybody have to deal with this? And then everything in between. And I think, as we were talking, we said, no, like action is important, it is, and political action is important. And as we, that, and can be effective. And it isn't just spirituality. The scriptures don't know a spirituality that is separate or disconnected from everyday life. But I think you're saying, hey, we actually need to, part of our role in the church is to, when you see a fire going out, to say, no, like this cannot go out. And there may have been something that catalyzed the uprising of it, the spark, but our job is saying, no, God's heart has burned for this for centuries. So part of even this conversation, let's not let it die. I know I've felt that, the fight in my own life to go, oh, are we going to preach on it every weekend? A kind of cynicism like that, and saying, no, we can't actually let that. This isn't about that question. It's about saying, how does this not die in our hearts if God is actually drawing our attention to something that is so broken and hurting? So anyways, that's why we were having this conversation around that. Totally. Lori, what, as you've been thinking through this, how do you respond?
Yeah, and I think for me, when all of this sort of came down, with George Floyd's murder and all of that, and then the Blackout Tuesday on social media, I consciously, like, I had to pause and think about, like, I feel like I have to post a black square, because if I don't, then I'm not supporting this. But if I do, it feels like right now, because I think what I've been facing in the last few weeks is my shame over my ignorance, and also an awakening to my own privilege, despite the fact that I'm not white, but I have I have privilege because I'm not Black. And so it's been a very soul searching few weeks for me, where I've been thinking about this. And so I decided to start reading 2 different books. One is called Me and White Supremacy, and it's written by a Black, actually Black Muslim woman, which has been a fascinating perspective to hear from. But also I've been reading I'm Still Here by Austin Channing Brown, and that's written by a Black Christian woman. And in both cases, what I've kind of been awakened to is just how the power that's at work is both in systems and in places that we don't directly necessarily influence. And the power that's at work is there's a systemic power at work within us, within our psyche, within our unconsciousness, that we don't realize, and that we've been, yeah, like there's like I've been going through waves of shock and sadness and anger and confusion over all of it. And I think that has been both a difficult process, but a good one for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I likewise too. I feel like there's this battle within me of like, because the closer you get to it, the more I'm also reading a couple of books and primarily about people's stories that are just getting inside me. And I've noticed this in my own home, and even just talking with, my oldest son, this is really wrecking him. And we've been talking about, okay, that's actually part of letting it begin to seep into the insides of us. I've also been recognizing as a parent, and you guys are parents too, and not everybody is, but if you are, thought when you talk about powerlessness, it's a lie to think that we cannot or are not called to change the world. That is what parenting is, in terms of multiplying and things that we are starting to value, and even though I would say, well, so many years have passed, and I have many years left, but like in terms of choosing a career path or a direction for life, our young people still all have that ahead of them. And I've just been starting to pray, God, mark this moment in their lives for those who are aware of it, that this would be a life altering moment, but that some of them would say, I should go into politics. I should go into justice studies, policing, whatever. Like I should be, one of the stats that came up recently was just how much PTSD is a part of the policing experience, and yet how few people are actually encouraged to or acting to get help with that. And sort of recognizing there are people, again, within whom we would say have the power. The power itself is, and the things that they are forced into, invited into, whatever, are also exacting a toll on them. And so I've just been praying, God, let our young people, make decisions, and let us not be afraid to challenge them to do that with their lives, even if we feel we didn't or are still wrestling through what that means for us, right?
Yeah, I think, Vijay, when you talk about sort of PTSD, the impact on our police officers, but just all of the sort of systems, as somebody who didn't grow up sort of in a Christian context, I think one of the things that has been compelling for me about sort of, again, the Christian faith is the explanation of sort of how evil exists in the world. And again, I think that just as I look at these sort of systems and the way this works, I'm like, yes, like my faith calls out, this is a reality that it isn't just sort of the authorities, but there's a greater authority that is sort of insidiously sort of infecting and affecting all of this. And so I think one of the questions is sort of as Christians, we need to face, like there's an acknowledgement of that reality, not a minimization of it, but then going, okay, well, how do we respond in light of that being a part of what's going on?
Yeah, it's the power behind the power. When we talk about the power dynamics, it's actually, as Christians, we're honest about, we don't just go, oh, it's spiritual, but if we don't actually acknowledge the power behind the power, like this fall, we're doing a series on Revelation, there's this contrast between the beast, which for those reading Revelation were these emperors who were trying to like kill them, who were beastly, but there's the dragon behind the beast, which John's vision was, this is the same age-old power that has been against God and the things of God, that has been against the peace that God brings, against ideas of like unity, acceptance, the inherent dignity of all human beings, like care for each other, the valuing of diversity. Those are all the things that are the heart of God as he's created us. And there has been an enemy of power against those things. And so to see that that's a power at work, because otherwise, how do you explain how things, one thing to like hate people that have oppressed you, and in their hate, you respond in hate. It's another thing to hate people who actually you have had power over your whole life, who are not a threat to you. Where does that come from, and how does it perpetuate itself over and over? It makes you, Jen and I were having this conversation this week. This is demonic. There's a spiritual power behind this that has a hold on us in both passive, indirect ways and in active ways. And so, yeah, like some of this is actually just saying we need to. Prayer is a huge thing that the church in our upcoming Encounter Prayer Night, we want to actually pray into this, and not just for the people who are victims of this, who are suffering in it, not just for us to, but against the powers of and the Apostle Paul says, right, this is not primarily a flesh and blood battle, although it works itself out that way, but there's a power behind this, and if you're ignorant of it, you're missing something. So, yeah, I mean, how do we pray into this?
I think one of the things that, as you were talking, I was realizing is that we have to acknowledge our own complicity. Like, in a sense, like we are complicit. It's not just a demonic power that's out there, that's happening outside of us, but to a certain extent, like many of us are, without knowing necessarily, complicit. And like there's like, it's like, I think on the one hand it's like Jesus, like set me free from any part of me that like is sitting in a place of judgment or sitting in a place of superiority or like being better than those around me, um or not willing to see people for who they are. Like, I just think that there are so many ways in which that happens. Race is not the only way that happens, right? Of course it isn't, but clearly it is. And I think we in Canada especially think that we're exempt from that, and we're not.
Yeah.
And I think it can be a very easy trap for us to fall in, like, and as the church too, where it's like God forgive us. Like, I think that's maybe a place also to start, is just um, by acknowledging our sin and knowing that Jesus is the one who loves perfectly, and Jesus is the one who created each of us uniquely and loves all of it equally, right? He's the one who is able to do, he's the one who actually understands what equality means.
Yeah, I think definitely that sort of call to repentance. I think just the, like, again, the mourning and the grieving as an element of just sort of going like, okay, like let us not rush past the reality and the felt experience of this. Like, let's sort of see the effects of the power behind the power. And then I think, like, in some ways, like, right, a lot of my prayers are like, Jesus, come. Like, I don't have all the answers. I'm like he came, his mission was one of reconciliation, of healing, of restoration, and of sort of freedom from bondage. I'm like, yes, like I need all of those things. I need all of that. And so like, I think just on the, like, I'm reading about policing Black lives, about sort of the reality in Canada in some senses, to sort of just go, okay, I've seen sort of some of the out there what's happened in the States, but going like, okay, I need to face this.
What's the name of that book, Mel, that you're reading?
It's called Policing Black Lives. It's about sort of the history of state violence in Canada. And again, I go like, for me, it's about, okay, I need to, not just educate myself on sort of my role, but just sort of understand the history of the place and the where we are. And going like as I look at it, and sort of, again, it's sort of talking about stuff like the way in which child protective services and sort of some of these sort of things play in to the Black experience. And I go, okay, I feel so unprepared to respond, but I go like God's heart and Jesus came for exactly to sort of restore this stuff. And so, like,
Yeah, and I think we need to pray for our eyes to be open, because there's clearly, like, part of what the enemy does is he blinds us, like he keeps us in the
He's the
dark.
deceiver.
Yeah, and his work is work of darkness, and so,
Yeah.
like, how do we come out of darkness into light on this
Yeah.
issue?
And I think one of the ways to gauge where we're at is what is our gut reaction to this. So my immediate thing is to try to explain it away and a counter perspective or whatever. And early on, because of some of what I was reading, I just felt like God's like, I'm not going to let you do that. I want you to enter into this. And there's always other perspectives. That's not the point. It doesn't discount the pain and the reality of what is actually going on. And so I think if our initial reaction is to turn away, if our initial reaction is to intellectualize it, if our initial reaction is to politicize it, if our initial reaction is to try to provide counter perspective, I would, as I've asked me, I'd ask you as you're listening and watching this, why are you doing that? And what is that actually a way of obfuscating something that's actually that's underneath for all of us, that we just need to, and we can be defensive about it, like someone who works in policing could be defensive about a book like that, just like I as a pastor could be defensive about how the church, capital C, has perpetuated racism and racial divide. But I sort of go, because I could say, well, I don't have that in my heart. It's like, well, partly I do because I'm a product of it. And well, that's not the point. The question is, well, as I am someone in a church community and a faith leader, what does it mean for us? What does it mean for me to do what I'm doing to bring, with the Lord's Prayer, that God's will would be done on earth, that his kingdom down here would be like it is in heaven. That's the call.
Yeah, and again, I that's not a quick thing. Like again, I was listening to a podcast of a couple of sort of black people, and they were sort of saying, like, man, like that they're expecting this all to fade away in the coming while. Okay, the protests are going to stop, and then it's going to go back. And like, if you sort of ask my heart posture would have been typically one of apathy. Like, this is like, again, I think about Ferguson, I think about Rodney King, like, I'm like, oh, this is like just one more thing. And I think the thing that God has been saying is like, okay, there is a slow work that is the work of the church, which is sort of genuine transformation and genuine reconciliation, and going, okay, I don't know that I can call out exactly what that means, but I think, like, I feel the call to say, hey, this is something for us to be leaning in for the long haul, and for me to be leaning in the long haul, because again, his will, his kingdom vision is one of restoration and equality in diversity.
Yeah. And I think that fundamentally at its heart, this is about people, not about issues. Because the gospel story is one of people. It is reconciliation. You mentioned that word, Mal. The heart of God's move towards us was reconciliation. Paul says that the church has been given a ministry of reconciliation. And it isn't just come back to God, be forgiven, be in a right relationship with God. Of course, that is the center of all things. But the thread throughout all of Scripture is that the fractured, divided, because of nationality, race, tribalism, whatever, human race is being restored together. And so that's why the picture of the new creation is not just one of individual oneness with God. Like, this Christian story rejects a kind of resolution that isn't inherently community oriented, and where it talks about the nations and people from every tribe and tongue and nation. The New Testament is expansive in its language of a unity and diversity, and that the resolution to all things looks like a united people with God as like the sun at its center. So that's what we're working towards, and that's why we can't say this doesn't matter. This is so tied in to that story of redemption. And at the same time, you're right, it's going to take time. So I would say, just as you're watching and as you're listening, a few things that we've mentioned, some of which are just reading, like books. And I would say, look, if you're a reader, just make this one of your next books. Like, if you're, there's documentaries on Netflix, there's stuff, if you're going to watch something, which you probably are, watch one of these things. If you have people in your circle from a different ethnic background than you, can I say that? Have a conversation. How has it been like? Our stories are all different. Malcolm, Lori, and I were talking about each of us in different our stories are different. They're not the same. And this is the whole point, is don't bring sameness. I don't want to bring my context of this to yours. So how do we talk and listen and engage in that? And then have conversations, certainly with young people in your life, about, hey, do you think that maybe some of what's going on is God maybe getting your attention for direction in your life? Whether that is vocationally or just even how you use a social media platform that you have. If you're a songwriter, how do you let that influence? If you're an artist, if you're someone who wants to be a teacher in business or whatever, or if you are, what influence, a little circle. It's not about, the power. Jesus talked about power as influence relationally. So what is that circle? And then I would say communally, like, that we as a church commit to each other to just keep this at the forefront, on the front burner, in terms of our conversations informally with each other. But our upcoming Encounter Prayer Night on Wednesday, June 24th, we're going to be taking time to have time to grieve this, to have time to pray into it, both in terms of the people dimensions of it, and then in terms of the spiritual, the power behind the power. Some active praying on that. So that's another way that you can lean into this. So I just, thanks for listening, Lori, Malcolm. Thank you for being people in my life who are saying, let's not let this, fire die out long after maybe other things have stopped in the world around us. Let's let this spur us on as the church. So thanks for that.
Our pleasure.
God
Thanks.
bless.
God bless.
Bye.
Bye.